Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Aquinas. Up until now, we've been discussing very slowly, very carefully Aquinas' rationale for thinking that God exists. From now onward, we're not going to be as slow and careful. Again, Aquinas wrote a lot of stuff. We can spend years and years just going slowly through his rationale. From the next couple of times, we're just going to look at some of his conclusions to just get a better sense of the picture that he paints. But we're not going to go carefully through the arguments, not because they're not there. He wrote a lot. There are a lot of very careful arguments. But rather, we just want to get a basic description of his conception of reality, and especially how God grounds the intelligibility of that reality. So let us look at some of the conclusions that he derives about God and reality, how reality relates to God, without being as careful of keeping track of his arguments for those conclusions. So the first question for us is, what do the arguments prove? What is this thing that comes about as the reasonable thing to endorse, the reasonable conclusion of the inquiry into reality? What is exactly this thing that is being proven by the arguments? And as I've said in the past, the best way of reading Aquinas is as a scientist, in a broad description of the term. When he talks about God, he really is talking about kind of theoretical postulate, a thing that explains the things that are given by the senses. We open our eyes, we look around, and all sorts of information comes to us. The senses are a connection to reality. And we reason, we think upon the information given to us by the senses, and we construct this intelligible description of reality. We postulate entities that describe and make intelligible that reality. And the main entity, the main thing that explains reality for Aquinas is God. God just is the theoretical postulate that explains reality. In the way that it's demanded by the arguments, that some of which we've seen. So a different way of saying this is that for Aquinas, the word God just refers to the thing that follows from the arguments, the unmoved mover that explains why things are in motion. So God just is the postulate that exists, that brings things into existence, but it's itself not brought into existence by other things. Or more broadly, God is the thing that is moving other things, but nothing is moving it. So it's the thing that explains all motion by being the original principal mover that gives rise to the motion. And there be no other thing that explains God's motion. That's what makes it God. If there were just an intermediary mover, for example, if there were a hierarchy of gods and the creator of the world would be just a lower God, then that wouldn't be the God of the arguments. The God of the arguments is the one that there is no prior one that explains it. If there were just this intermediary God that created the world, and then a higher God created it, and then a higher God created that, and so on, then Aquinas will say, well, let's talk about that chain of causations there. And none of the links in the chain will be labeled the unmoved mover. It would just be another link, another much more impressive chain, but another series of links in the chain. So for something to count as God for Aquinas, it has to be the origination of the motion, of all the motion, of bringing things into existence. And the word God just refers to that thing that does the explanation. And likewise for the other arguments, God is the necessary being that explains why merely contingent being exists, as argument 3. Or God is goodness itself, or beauty itself, or truth itself. The forms, the perfect forms, the maximum exemplars of these perfections that explain why finite things have these perfections to one extent or the other. That's argument 5. So God just is the label that refers to the theoretical postulate that makes intelligible reality on the basis of the things that are observed, and then we reason their way through to God, through the arguments. So put differently, God is the thing that best explains or makes intelligible empirical reality as we see it. And again, as illustrated through arguments, we see motion, God explains that motion. And we see contingent beings, gradations of perfections, and so on. And the more we think about it, there must be a thing that explains that. And that thing is just a postulate that is God. A different way of getting a grip on what I mean by a theoretical postulate, what Aquinas takes to be kind of the status of God as attained by reason, is to compare it with another theoretical postulate, with gravity in physics. So when I teach this person to person, I ask my students, how many of you see gravity? And most students do not raise their hands, but inevitably there's a couple that raise their hands and of course, I mean, I see it all the time. Look, there it is. But if you think about it, you don't actually see gravity, right? So here's the pen. I drop it, it falls. You see that. You see objects falling. And people, throughout history have noticed that. They've noted that if you have an object, you drop it, it falls. So people see objects falling. But gravity is not that, right? Gravity is the force postulated by scientists that explains the motion. That's why we really don't have a good theory of gravity until like the 18th century with Newton. People didn't see it before because no one sees gravity. We don't see it now. Gravity is best understood as something, a force that is invisible. We don't see it. We just see its consequences or its effects. We see things falling. And then we create this theory in which explains the motion of those things that fall. And we postulate this thing that we call the gravitational force. And the word gravity just refers to the thing, the force that does the explanation for the things that fall. So to think that gravity exists, then we reasonably think that it does. We don't have to actually see it because it's invisible. We can see it. And to say that gravity exists just is to say that there is an entity, a thing in the world that answers to, that explains some phenomena that we observe, namely things falling. And it's embedded in this theory, embedded in this conception of reality that if you understand it, you would come to predict the motion of other things as they fall and so on. So gravity is a theoretical postulate in physics that makes intelligible why things fall and how they fall and so on. For Aquinas, God is very similar, at least through the recent perspective. He's also a believer, right? So he believes a lot of things in the basis of faith as well, but we're not talking about that. As a philosopher, as a scientist, he thinks God is this postulate. God is this entity that we reasonably think about it when we look at the world and postulate as the thing that makes intelligible reality. It's like a scientific postulate. That's a grip unto God using reason alone. So Aquinas, again, sees himself as an empiricist. He begins with the senses. He postulates things that explain the senses. And he's just doing science in a broad conception of science. God becomes the theoretical postulate that explains reality as it is, using scientific reasoning in a broad conception of scientific reasoning. So here are some more things that Aquinas thinks are true of God that kind of gives us a basic conception of reality. In question 6 in Summa Theologica, he asks in Article 1 whether God is good as in perfection. Is God perfect? And here's what he says. To be good belongs preeminently to God. In other words, God is not just good. He's kind of infinitely good. The kinds of goodness we see around when we see goodness in the world are finite, are limited. They're limited approximations of the goodness that is God, that belongs to God preeminently. So here's an objection to thinking that goodness applies to God or that God is good. In terms of perfection, not just moral perfection, but perfection in general. The good is what all desires. Everything in existence strives towards its own perfection. That seems to be an observation that Aristotle and Aquinas made a big deal out of. But all things do not desire God, because all things do not know God, do not know him. And nothing is desired unless it is known. Therefore, to be good does not belong to God. Goodness is the thing that everyone strives after, but a lot of people are atheists or don't believe in God. So goodness cannot be God. Goodness cannot belong preeminently to God. And Aquinas takes this objection seriously. Here's what he says in response to this objection, which illustrates a lot of his conception of reality. Quote, all things by desiring their own perfection, and we naturally do, everything naturally does, desire God himself, inasmuch as the perfections of all things are so many similitudes of the divine being. In other words, beauty, truth, goodness, any kind of perfection, knowledge, it's a perfection in virtue of resembling God. And to the extent that beings want to perfect their own nature, be better versions of themselves, to that extent, knowingly or unknowingly, they're striving to be more like God. In our strive for perfection, we are striving to be like the thing that is most perfect, which is God. So we are kind of unknowingly striving to be like God, or perhaps even have union with God, Aquinas would say at some point. So the whole of reality is to be understood as beings that have natures that try to perfect themselves in different ways. And in attempting to do so, beings are trying to be like God. They're striving to be closer to the divine. And that's everywhere. Trees are doing it. You and I are doing it. Every being who's striving to be a better version of themselves, and we naturally do that. We're striving to be more like God. You see it everywhere, Aquinas thinks. So God is good. He has all perfections. Everything that is in the world perfect to some extent is so because it resembles God, and it's to the extent that it strives to be more perfect, it strives to be like God. That's a basic kind of way of thinking about the world. Here's another strange question: whether God is everywhere. Is God somewhere? And if so, where? So here's an objection to Aquinas' view on this subject matter. What is holy in one place is not in part elsewhere. My pen is holy here where my fingers are, right? It's holy here, which means that it's not partly in my house, or it's not partly in one of the drawers on my desk. If it's holy here, it cannot be in part elsewhere. Now, of course, it can be in part here and in part here, right? It can be partly there and partly here, but if it's wholly here, then it cannot be in part over there, someplace else. That's an observation about location in space-time, about things that are located within space-time. So let's apply that to God. If God is in any one place, say in this office, he is all of it there because he has no part, right? My pen can be partly here and partly here, precisely by part of it being here and part of it being down here. So to be in two different places, or they're adjacent places, at once is to have two different parts, each of which is in one of those places at the same time. God has no parts. That's something that Aquinas argues for elsewhere. Because God has no parts, it cannot be that God is in many places by having different parts of God being in different places, like the pen is in a couple of different places at the same time. So if God is somewhere, he has to be wholly there. And if God is wholly someplace, like my pen, if my pen is wholly here, it cannot be elsewhere as well. So if God is wholly somewhere in this office, then God cannot also be someplace else, like church. So whatever God is, because he has no parts, he has to be wholly there. To be wholly in some place means that one cannot be partly some other place other than that location. So God cannot be everywhere, is the conclusion. This is an objection to Aquinas' conception of God. Here's what he says, and let's read this carefully. Things placed are in place inasmuch as they fill place. And God fills every place. So the second part, God is everywhere. Not indeed like a body. So there's a different way of filling space, different way of occupying space-time. Not like my pen. It's a different way. For a body is said to fill place inasmuch as it excludes the co-presence of another body. So there's a way of occupying space that God has that is different from the way of occupying space that bodies do. And what is that? Well, he tells us in the second part of the sentence. This pen is such that when it fills space or occupies space, when it's here, it excludes the co-presence of another object. So if my finger wants to be in the same place, it has to like push it away, right? It cannot just, they cannot both be my finger and the pen at the same place at the same time. When my finger tries to occupy the same space, it pushes. It excludes the co-presence of another body. Bodies compete for location. They cannot two at the same time occupy, they push each other away. That's how one of the ways in which bodies occupy space, fill space or fill place. But God is different. The way in which God occupies space is different, or God is in a place is different. Whereas by God being in a place, others are not thereby excluded from it. So God is everywhere, but not in the way in which pens and desks and fingers are in places or in space and time. Namely, God does not exclude the co-presence of another body in the same location. God can be in this office, and so can I be in the office, so can my desk be in the office, so can my books be in the office. God's way of occupying space is one which does not exclude there being other things, especially bodies, that are in that place as well. Uh, and bodies don't do that, but God does. And by doing this, God fills every place. So God is everywhere, and in such a way that he does not exclude the presence of other things being there, things like bodies. So that's kind of weird, but like that's intelligible, right? That's it's not inconsistent position. Um, and furthermore, Aquinas thinks that God is not just everywhere; he's fully located everywhere because he has no parts, right? The way in which he's everywhere, that's objection 3. It's not by being apart everywhere. Uh, Aquinas is going to say God is wholly located, fully located everywhere where God is located. So let that sink in. Here are some of the tools to try to explain what that is. So this is the reply to 3. A whole is called a whole in reference to a part. To say that something is whole is to say that it is kind of the sum total of the parts. Something only counts as a whole if it is in relation to parts. That's a terminological point. But now parts, the word part can be understood in two very different senses. In one, and I'm labeling this, Aquinas did not put a label, but other philosophers have afterwards. So I'm using the labels that other philosophers have employed onto this distinction between parts. And one is called metaphysical parts. The other one, integral parts. Let's begin with integral, because they're the kind of more commonsensical ones. Integral parts are parts of quantity, like hands of a body, and like leaves of a tree. Leaves and trunk and roots are the parts of the body. And those integral parts of quantity, the way in which they occupy space is the way in which we've been discussing bodies occupy space, by excluding the co-presence of others. So two parts like my right hand and my left hand cannot be in the same place, right? They push each other out. So they exclude the co-presence of other. That's one feature of the way in which my parts occupy space. But there's another way in which I occupy space. I occupy space by having different parts of me occupy different parts of space, right? So I can stand in the hall, in the doorway, for example, and I can extend my arm outside of the office and one arm inside. So it would be both inside and outside the office. I would be outside the office by having an arm outside the office. I'll be inside the office by having an arm inside the office. So I can occupy space by having two of my integral parts being at different parts of space, or I can occupy that, but having my integral parts occupying different parts. So that's how integral parts work. Metaphysical parts don't work that way. And distinction is between essence and existence. My essence is humanity because I'm a human. My existence is my being, the fact that I exist. And here's a weird fact about the way in which my existence and my essence occupy space according to Aquinas. So think of my shoulder. My shoulder is human and it exists. My nose is human and it exists. And it's not that it doesn't, it's not like my existence is broken up such that part of it is here and part of it is there, such that I wholly exist by existing partly here and partly there. My body is occupied partly here, partly there, but my existence is fully here, right? Like my shoulder fully exists. My nose fully exists. So my existence is fully located here and fully located in my nose. Likewise, my humanity. My nose is a human nose. My shoulder is a human shoulder. So the humanity of my shoulder is fully there. The humanity of my nose is fully there. So my humanity, my existence, they are located everywhere and in every part in which my body is located. At every of the integral parts of my body, my whole humanity is there and my whole existence is there. And it doesn't compete, right? My existence and my humanity of my nose they don't compete for the space. My nose is fully human and is fully existent, and the existence does not push out the humanity, or the humanity push out the existence. That's just not how existence and humanity work. And likewise, matter and form. We have to get into those distinctions for now, but there are different parts of me, in a different sense of the word part, namely metaphysical part, that occupy the space that my integral parts occupy, but in a different way, by being fully present everywhere where each of my integral parts is present, and by not excluding the co-presence of other metaphysical parts. The humanity of my nose does not exclude the existence of my nose. The existence of my nose does not exclude the humanity of my nose. They are fully located in my nose, in my shoulder, my eyes, my hair. That's a weird way of being, of occupying, of filling space. Aquinas' point is that that's how God occupies space. God is everywhere by being fully located everywhere in such a way that God does not exclude the co-presence of other things there. So what is whole and part of quantity integral parts cannot be outside of that place. If my location, physical location is here, I cannot be elsewhere as well. However, God can, because he occupies places in the metaphysical sense. Like, although my humanity is here, my nose is fully human, but my shoulder is fully human too. So my humanity can be here and here, but fully here and fully here. And that's fine, that humanity can work that way. God can do that too. So let's stop here. We'll pick up a discussion of Aquinas next time. See ya. Bye.